This podcast comes to you from the University of Toronto, Mississauga. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the university operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to work on this land, and we strive toward peace and reconciliation among all peoples. Hi, I'm Jill Caskey, Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Welcome, listeners, to Medieval Art Matters, a podcast where we invite a scholar to talk about a critical issue that shaped experiences of people living centuries ago and that still matters today. I'm joined by my co-host, Adam Cohen, for a discussion of today's theme, curating and the global imperative.
Thank you, Jill. I'm delighted to be co-hosting this episode of Medieval Art Matters. Currently, I'm an associate professor of art history at the University of Toronto, but many years ago, I worked in the Department of Manuscripts at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, so I'm especially interested in revisiting questions about how medieval art is collected, curated, and displayed in museums. Our guest is Dr. Griffith Mann, the Michel David-Weill curator in charge at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he oversees the medieval collections of the Met Fifth Avenue and the Met Cloisters. Before joining the Met, he was deputy director and chief curator at the Cleveland Museum of Art and the director of the curatorial division at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. I've known Dr. Mann since we were both graduate students at the Johns Hopkins University, and so it's a special delight to speak with him today.
Thanks, Adam. Pleasure to be here.
Welcome, Dr. Mann, and thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much, Jill.
So we're looking at two sculptures on the podcast page of artofthemiddleages.com. One is an enthroned virgin and child, and the other a Bodhisattva. Dr. Mann, could you briefly introduce these two works and describe them to our listeners?
Sure. These are two objects that are both part of the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, one from the Medieval Department and one from the Department of Asian Art. And they've been brought together in a special installation. Both objects are sculpted out of wood, largely single block of wood. Both feature polychromy, painted decoration. And interestingly, both also are not just works of sculpture, but are also containers for objects that would have been inserted inside the sculptures to activate them for their users.
They're both in an exhibition that is called Crossroads. Can you tell us a little bit about the exhibition, why it has that title, and how the exhibition has been different from other undertakings at museums like the Met?
One of the things I would say, Adam, is that this, rather than an exhibition, is more an installation. So it's a way of kind of reflecting a different way of presenting and installing works of art in the permanent collection. And the title actually comes out of a conversation that I had with our then incoming director, Max Holein, during his early days at the Met. He went around and visited with various departments, and we were spending time in our galleries in the medieval department at the Met's Fifth Avenue building, where the medieval galleries are really at the very heart of the museum. And in many ways, that gallery is actually a kind of crossroads space. It's a major thoroughfare as people cross the building from the American wing to modern and contemporary, or from the main entrance of the Met into the Lehman wing. And one of the things that Max remarked on was that although the Met is a very broad collection in terms of its geography and chronology, one could think of it as an encyclopedic institution, there isn't any one moment where visitors really get a sense in a glimpse of the encyclopedic scope of the collections. And we began thinking about whether it would be possible to reflect in that space a sense of the geographic and chronological scope of the collections. And with that assignment, we began thinking about what would make sense in that space and decided to focus on the period of time that we use in our own department to think about the Middle Ages. So the 4th century AD, roughly speaking, to around the year 1500. And focus on bringing in works of art that were made during that time period that speak to some of the issues that medieval art raises. So although the installation is presented within our galleries, it really is a global installation. It includes objects from Asia, as you've seen with the one object that we've selected to talk about today, and the Americas, as well as the Islamic world. It's really intended to provide a kind of overview of the kinds of things that people can expect to find at the Met, but in a way that is meaningful and resonant for the gallery itself, where that material is presented.
I think that's given us a great sense of both this particular installation and some of the larger issues facing the Met. But I'd like to bring you back to the two objects themselves and focus in a little bit. What's the point? What are we supposed to draw out of the particular juxtaposition of the Bodhisattva and the Virgin and Child sculpture?
I think for me, one of the things that's always been captivating about the Middle Ages is that many of the objects that we deal with lived a devotional life or a ritual or a functional life beyond the art life that it now lives within the context of an art museum gallery space. And what for me unifies these two objects is that they are both images of divinities that are intended to serve as fulcrums between one world and another. They are also objects that would have been activated through the insertion of relics or precious objects that invested those wooden objects with a sense of presence that's perhaps different than we might think about a work of sculpture as being, invested with this aura. These two sculptures are actually part of a group of three objects that have been gathered together because they relate to the broader concepts of the holy. Sacred aura is the term that we've used to describe these three objects and what they have in common. And these two works in particular are very interesting in relation to each other because they both conceal hidden compartments that would have been used to hold relics. In the case of the Virgin and Child, the relic bundles are still present in the object, whereas in the case of the Guanyin figure from China, that compartment is still there, and there is an inscription that indicates precisely when the sculpture was made, but the investment, the materials that were placed inside that chamber are now gone.
So, Dr. Mann, what kinds of pressures are involved in conceiving and producing an installation like this one?
I think one of the things that's always a challenge is how do you bring works of art together from different cultural realms and have them make sense with each other? I think in some respects, there's a kind of formalist approach behind this installation. We looked at these sculptures in particular to think about the visual connections that draw them together. And I think that there are also ritual associations that one can use as a lens to look at these two works of art. But I think anytime you bring together two objects from such disparate locations and belief systems, it's a challenge. Like, how can you be authentic to the context that these objects would have come from, and at the same time make meaningful connections for contemporary audiences that might encourage them to think about these works of art in different ways?
You've given a really great sense of how this space, this installation of Crossroads really provides an opportunity for you to showcase all of the interconnecting aspects of the collection at the Met and to juxtapose objects that normally we don't get a chance to see together, to consider these kinds of synergies about form and function and ritual presence. Given the complexities of a show like this or an installation like this, what's at stake with it for you?
I think one of the things that is at stake and that's essential in an installation like this is using some of the contemporary discussions that are taking place within our own field about taking a more expansive view of the Middle Ages, just to take one example. To reflect that in our permanent installations, I think is really important. I think very often for museums, the new research, the new scholarship is often driven by exhibitions. And although exhibition spaces provide opportunities for people to think about collections in new and different ways, or works of art and their relationships to their cultures in different ways, I think it's less the case in conventional installations that occurs. I think maybe that's beginning to change, but as it stands now, even at the Met with installations like this, they remain exceptions rather than the norm. Typically, you'll walk through a set of galleries and objects are organized by geography and time. And that art historical lens certainly provides one way of thinking about that material. But I think as the field of medieval studies is responding to new questions, we wanted to make sure that in our permanent collection installations, we were participating in some of those dialogues. One thing I would say is that although many of the cultures on view, so to speak, in the installation were in direct contact with each other, some of them were not. And it's interesting to see what's happening in one part of a world in terms of, something as straightforward as the production of sculpture and how it relates to or is quite different from traditions during the same time period in other parts of the world. And I feel like that's something that the Met, not uniquely, but perhaps is in a very special place to do, just given the scope and strength of its collections.
Some of these ideas are what motivated us to write Art and Architecture of the Middle Ages, Exploring a Connected World, which exists as both a printed book and on this website. It's clear that there's this interconnected relationship between the academy and the museum, as you described. You and I were in graduate school together, and my career path went off to the university and the classroom, and you went off to the museum. So when I go to a place like the Met or any museum, I have a certain experience, but you're behind the scenes and you bring a completely different perspective to the whole operation. So could you share with the people listening some of the main issues and challenges that you face that we don't think about either as professional art history teachers or as regular visitors to museums?
I mean, reflecting on that question, Adam, I think there are ways in which the academy and the museum are definitely interconnected. We're both engaged in scholarship of one kind or another. Publications are certainly a big portion of what museums generate, in addition to the many articles and books that come out of university contexts. And we all work to some extent with physical objects, but I think in the museum, you work much more closely, obviously, with the physical objects themselves. So you have a responsibility towards the care of collections, but there are also issues like cultural patrimony. And then there's just the logistics sometimes. One of the things that was really exciting about this project is that it requires a large team of individuals to come together to realize an installation like this. You have to have the casework fabricated to hold the objects. Sometimes for the larger objects, you have riggers that are required to move these things around. So I think when I walk through a museum space, I'm often thinking, I suppose I'm sort of geeking out a little bit on looking at things like design, label copy, the kind of physical furniture of an installation. And I think one of the challenges in a space like the sculpture hall is that because this room, this gallery where these objects are exhibited is so large, that one of the first considerations for us was really just one of scale. We had to make sure that one, in each group, we featured objects from our own collection, because after all, this remains a medieval gallery. And two, that those objects had to be of a scale and a quality level that could kind of hold their own in the space in the various groupings that we've devised. And I think there's a wonderful dialogue that happens between the Guanyin figure and the Throne of Wisdom figure that we're considering today, not only because they're both three-dimensional objects rendered in wood, but also because their ritual contexts are in some ways overlapping with each other. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges in the context of a museum is the object is by itself, and you have to do what you can to evoke the kind of ritual context that these works of art would have been part of. That's easier to do in an exhibition sometimes, where you have, a lot of resources and energy focused on presenting the objects in a certain way. And in the permanent collection galleries, they've got to live within a kind of larger ecosystem where the gallery itself and its surroundings are sympathetic to the specific conversations that you're trying to generate between works of art. So thinking through things like that, where I suppose the biggest difference is thinking in space and objects rather than in words and chapters, when you're thinking about the kind of output of what you might be doing within a university context versus a museum.
I can think of one other critical difference, and that's embedded in the rich answer you just gave. And it has to do with conservation, because all of us live in the present, which is the fulcrum between the past and the future. Now, as historians, we spend most of our time looking at the past, but I imagine that particularly in the museum context, you're concerned not just with the preservation of the works, but you're thinking forward much more than I certainly do. And so I wonder what your dreams and aspirations are. What would you hope to see happen in the field of medieval curatorial work and the life of objects in museums?
Yeah, it's a great question, Adam, and I'm not sure I have a quick answer to it. I would say that in terms of looking to the future and speaking for the medieval department at the Met, one of the exciting things about this project has been working with colleagues in other departments and understanding that they're willing to part with really important objects in their own galleries, with the understanding that we're telling a story that crosses the collections. And in a certain way, I think this project has allowed us and encouraged us to think about our own spaces in different ways. I think very often when people come into that part of the museum, it feels like such a set piece that it's hard to imagine that there are ways of thinking differently about that material. And my own feeling is that this particular project, Crossroads, has opened up relationships with other departments that will be very important for us going forward, and will also allow us to think about asking new kinds of questions of the material that we deal with that responds to some of the scholarship that's happening within the context of universities, that's really pushing the boundaries of how we think about our period, not necessarily in terms of time frame, but certainly in terms of geography and the issues and the kinds of objects that we're trying to bring to light. For our collections, I would say just one example is that in the past, the museum historically hadn't been focused on Jewish art. And one major initiative in our acquisition program now is really to be focused on trying to tell that story, not in ways that are complete, because we can never tell a complete story of an area of cultural patrimony where there's so much missing, but at least to bring that to the conversation within the Met's permanent collection is something that we're very much committed to. So I think as we look towards the future, we're probably focused on different kinds of priorities, even in terms of acquisitions, than our predecessors might have been, because we are responding to some of the changes in the field and in the way that people think about our period.
Great. It seems like with those changes that have been brought about by the collaborative nature of the Crossroads installation, and another forward-looking or future-looking endeavor is the website accompanying that show. And I wonder if you could maybe say a few words about that and how that might fit in within other projects and the Met's overall vision for the future.
I mean, the website is tremendously important to the Met's overall presence and its engagement with both students and teachers, as well as researchers and general audiences. I think one of the great things about the website that is a simple thing is that it allows us to feature images of works of art that expand the ways in which we can think about those objects that are different than how you might encounter them in the gallery. So to take one example, one of the objects that we're thinking about, the Throne of Wisdom in our own collection, that's a focus of this episode. Online, we're able to feature details, the kinds of close looking that you probably could do in the gallery, but in some ways the object has a different presence online than it does in physical space. So the other thing that's great about having these kinds of special projects featured online is that we have the collections portion of our website where we can feature the kind of, let's call it the permanent record of that object. But then in the Crossroads section of the website, you get a sense of how that object intersects with other groups of objects in different ways. I would say that the website has become absolutely critical to the museum's presence online, but also its accessibility to people who might not ever have the chance to walk through the doors.
Right. And even after the Crossroads installation has been deinstalled and the objects have gone back to their original homes, there'll be a record of this. And as evocative as your words were at painting a picture of what the experience in the gallery is like, most people are not going to be able to go and see it. And so at least they have the opportunity to experience it online. We, of course,
Yeah.
want to encourage people to go to museums. Don't get me wrong, but this is a wonderful supplement that has all of the advantages you mentioned.
I'm glad you feel that way. And I think actually for both universities and museums, the experience of the pandemic has absolutely transformed how we think about ourselves and the activities that can take place online. It's wonderful to think about the rich resources that we can make available to audiences through the digital.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mann, for coming to speak with us today. It's been really great hearing more about the show and all the other work that you're doing at the Met and Cloisters.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be with you both. Thank you so much for the interest in the project.
That was Griffith Mann on curating the medieval world in museums today. You've been listening to an episode of Medieval Art Matters, hosted by Adam Cohen and me, Jill Caskey. Medieval Art Matters complements the book written by Jill Caskey, Adam Cohen, and Linda Safran, called Art and Architecture of the Middle Ages, Exploring a Connected World. It is published by Cornell University Press. For more information, go to the website that accompanies the book, artofthemiddleages.com, where you'll also find more podcasts in this series.
Medieval Art Matters is made possible by the support of the Department of Art History at the University of Toronto, St. George Campus, and the Office of the Vice Principal and Dean, University of Toronto, Mississauga. Many thanks to the Toronto Consort for providing our music. This podcast was brought to you by Cited Media Productions.
Thanks for listening.
You have been listening to a Cited Media production. CIDED. Find out more at citedmedia.ca.